Right, so today in our discussion, we are going to be looking at what I think is a really complex and potentially polarizing topic on how pornography interacts with sexual functioning and human development over the lifespan. So, this is not a conversation about morality or personal choice, it's about recognizing that pornography um, in the way it is existing right now is significant, and there's some relatively new dimensions to it, and there are cultural forces that intersect now with key developmental stages. So technological shifts have not only made explicit content more accessible, but also changed the context in which individuals first encounter it. So, things like the frequency of exposure and the way it informs sexual scripts and expectations. So, as future mental health folks, our role is not to prescribe values, but um, we know this, right? But to understand the developmental, relational, and neurological implications of these changes, or at least that's my job in this class to bring these ideas forth. So, we're going to look at some emerging research on potential links to sexual dysfunction, and we're going to situate this conversation into the broader framework of lifespan development and how it could, especially early exposure, might impact identity formation, intimacy skills, and long term sexual satisfaction. So, for sure, as we've discussed, technology has just changed so much. And I think one of the biggest changes, of course, in sexual development over the past 2 decades has been just the sheer accessibility of pornography due to the internet and smartphones. So, we're not talking about a gradual shift. This is a technological leap that has fundamentally altered the context in which people first encounter sexual content. So, to give you a sense of scale, one doesn't often quote from Pornhub, but Pornhub alone reports millions of daily visitors, right? So the primary users are men under 34, but consumption patterns span genders and ages. And research out there estimates that between 64 to 76% of men and 23 to 41% of women in developed countries consume online pornography regularly. So, importantly, early exposure is now common. So, this means that many individuals are encountering explicit sexual material before they've developed the emotional, relational, and sometimes even the biological readiness, right, to integrate what they're seeing. So, from a lifespan development perspective, this early exposure can intersect again with things like identity formation, intimacy development, and sexual self concept. So, we want to think about how early and frequent exposure might influence expectations, arousal patterns, and relationships across the lifespan. And we also have to consider the developmental stage at which first exposure occurs, because encountering pornography at 11 is very different, has very different implications than at 21. So the concept of a supernormal stimulus that comes from behavioral science. So it's when we have an exaggerated version of a natural cue and that produces a stronger response than the cue itself. So in this context, online pornography delivers sexual stimuli that are more intense, more varied, and more immediately accessible than what our brains evolved to expect. So, this has two major implications for development and mental health counseling. First, the neurological impact. So, when the brain is repeatedly exposed to such heightened stimuli, the reward pathways can be reshaped. So, over time, this can alter how individuals experience sexual desire, arousal, and satisfaction, not only with pornography, but also in real life. Second, dopamine desensitization. So, frequent exposure to intensity sexual imagery can cause the brain's dopamine receptors to downregulate. So, this can make everyday sexual experiences feel less exciting or satisfying, especially if they lack the novelty and constant variation of digital content. So for us, this means we may encounter clients sometimes in adolescence or early adulthood whose sexual expectations, intimacy skills, and arousal responses are shaped less by I don't even want to say sometimes we will are encountering, right? Their arousal patterns are shaped less by real world experiences and more by digital patterns. So I think that these patterns can intersect with lifespan stages such as emerging adulthood or midlife in complex ways. And I think they're influencing relationship stability, sexual identity, and even mental health outcomes like anxiety or depression around intimacy. So here we see one of the more attention-grabbing shifts in sexual health data over the past 2 decades. So in the early 2000s, erectile dysfunction rates in men under 40 were estimated at around 5%. More recent studies are showing rates closer to 30% in the same age group. So before we jump to conclusions, it's important to note that research findings here are mixed. Some studies do link problematic pornography consumption um, with erectile dysfunction. Others find no direct causal relationship between moderate pornography use and sexual problems. So, but what is emerging is a more nuanced picture. It's not necessarily pornography use in general, but specific patterns of use that seem to matter. So, for example, high intensity, high frequency consumption that escalates over time, or reliance on pornography as the primary or exclusive form of sexual stimulation may be more closely associated with difficulties in real life sexual encounters. Another important point is that masturbation frequently alone does not explain the rise in ED. It's when sexual arousal becomes conditioned primarily to digital, high novelty, and often unrealistic stimuli that problems may appear. So, I think for our work, this means that if a client presents with sexual dysfunction, a thorough sexual history, including early exposure, patterns of use, and preferred stimuli, can be crucial for understanding their developmental and relational context. So here we're looking at what some researchers and clinicians are calling porn-induced erectile dysfunction or PIDE. So this term describes erectile dysfunction specifically linked to excessive or compulsive pornography consumption. And it's being discussed in certain circles as a potential new clinical category. So in one large study of over 3,400 men ages 18 to 35, 21% reported some level of erectile difficulty. And the findings again suggested a correlation between higher problematic pornography consumption and greater risk of ED. But importantly, this does not mean that every person who uses pornography will experience sexual dysfunction. Again, it's about patterns, intensity, and the way that sexual arousal becomes conditioned. I want to also say that clinically, PIDE is controversial. Some practitioners remain skeptical, pointing to confounding factors such as anxiety, depression, relationship issues, and other health problems as being connected, and an increasing number of mental health professionals are seeing young men report a specific pattern: difficulty achieving or maintaining erections in real life sexual encounters unless pornography is present. So, for us, I think this raises developmental questions. Again, how does early and prolonged reliance on digital sexual stimuli shape intimacy? Um, how do these patterns interact with life stages? And, especially things, timelines like emerging adulthood, when I think those sexual scripts and relational habits are being set. And I think these are critical considerations when we're working with people. While much of the conversation around pornography focuses on physical effect, like sexual function, the psychological and relational dimensions can be equally, if not more, impactful. So, heavy pornography consumption can create unrealistic expectations about bodies, sexual performance, and pleasure. And when those expectations are based on scripted, edited, and exaggerated depictions, um, real life experiences can clearly feel underwhelming by comparison. So this can lead to dissatisfaction, not necessarily because the partner is lacking, but because the mental template for what sex should look like has shifted. And research also shows that frequent comparison to pornography actors can erode self-esteem both for the viewer and their partner. Women in particular report that a partner's heavy porn use can cause relational strain, reduce intimacy, and even avoidance evidence of sexual contact. So, emerging technology like virtual reality pornography will most likely amplify these dynamics because, of course, VR is delivering this immersive, hyper realistic sexual experience that can be even harder for real life encounters to match. And from a developmental standpoint, especially for younger adults still forming sexual identities and relationship skills, this can set up patterns that make mutual satisfaction and authentic connection more challenging. So, for us, again, it's essential to assess not just the frequency of pornography use, but also its role in clients' relational world. All right. So, technology today isn't just influencing sexual behavior, it's actively shaping sexual development itself. So, today, adolescents are what some scholars call on life, meaning the line between online and offline existence is blurred, and digital and virtual environments are integral to identity formation, including sexual identity, desire patterns, and relational expectations. So, first, let's talk about digital immersion. So, for a lot of young people, much of their social, romantic, and even sexual interactions begins online. And this digital immersion means that sexual scripts, the mental template for what intimacy looks like, are increasingly informed by digital portrayals rather than lived relational experiences. Second, the formative experience or formative exposure, really. When pornography is encountered early and with little effort, it can really set that baseline for expectations again around body image, performance, and relational dynamics before any real world intimacy occurs. And from a lifespan development term or perspective, these formative exposures are going to influence how individuals navigate emerging adulthood. All right. When like these relational skills and sexual self concepts are consolidating. So, finally, the physical impact. We're seeing an increase in body modifications, performance anxiety, and a sense of physical alienation that are tied to digital sexual culture and pornified aesthetic standards, for lack of a better way to put it. And so these changes have implications not only for our, uh, not only not our, but I mean our collective, our right, sexual satisfaction, but also for broader self-esteem, identity, and mental health across the lifespan. So there's a lot here going on in terms of uh, needing to understand things through the lens of our client's digital ecosystem. So, when we step back from the research, one of the first things we notice is that there's no single universally agreed upon conclusion about pornography's impact on sexual desire. There's the contradictory research findings that I was mentioning, because even though I've talked about like some of the negative things, there's also potentially beneficial things like increased sexual exploration, communication and openness between partners. I mean, especially when it's mutual and non-compulsive. Second, there are gender differences, so men and women often experience the impact differently. Men are more likely to report physical sexual dysfunction, whereas women more often describe emotional and relational strain. So again, consumption patterns differ as well. So men tend to report higher frequency and different content preferences, which can shape outcomes. Third, I just want to talk about LGBTQIA considerations. So, for LGBTQIA clients, pornography can play a more complex role in sexual development and desire. For some, it may serve as an important early exposure of sexual identity exploration, particularly in environments where real world experiences feel unsafe or inaccessible. At the same time, certain portrayals in mainstream pornography can reinforce stereotypes, right? Exclude authentic depictions of queer intimacy or promote unrealistic body ideals, right? So we want to be uh, again attuned to how a client's pornography use intersects with the things I keep saying: identity formation, community connection, and relational expectations. Do I want to say anything else here? I'll leave it alone. Okay. So As I said, there's still no universal agreement about if this is problematic, if it should be a distinct mental health disorder. Some clinicians support categorizing it as compulsive sexual behavior disorder, which would emphasize that neurobiological parallel with addiction. Those things I was saying earlier in terms of changes in dopamine signaling. Um, but as well as things like compulsive use despite negative consequences and withdrawal-like symptoms, right? So others caution against pathologizing behaviors without considering the cultural and moral framework. So, for example, self-perceived addiction can be driven more by moral incongruence, that conflict, right, between personal behavior and cultural religious beliefs rather than frequency itself. So I think we can't just like ask for an assessment. How much porn do you watch? We need to explore like motivation, emotional context, psychological vulnerabilities, and cultural background to understand what the client's experience really means for their sexual health and overall functioning. So, as we look ahead, the landscape of human sexuality is evolving alongside our rapid technological changes. So, in this expanding cybersexual landscape, if you will, online sexual interaction continues to diversify. So, we're moving beyond static images and videos into these immersive VR experiences. Um, and feedback technologies that stimulate touch. We're talking about AI partners and robotic sex technologies that are advancing quickly. I think it's all pushing us to think about what intimacy means when the partner isn't human. I think the boundaries between virtual and physical intimacies are blurring in ways, of course, that we've never navigated before. So, in terms of evolving sexual development, today's digital natives are forming sexual identities in contexts that are historically unprecedented. So, relationship models such as polyamory, long distance virtual partnerships, and hybrid online offline relationships are emerging alongside these technological tools. And I think this means that our existing psychoanalytical and clinical models, many of which were developed, of course, before the digital age, need to be updated uh, to remain relevant and effective. I think digital literacy is now becoming essential to sexual health. And so being able to critically assess sexual context, I'm sorry, critically assess sexual content, understand consent in online spaces, and navigate privacy and safety concerns is a developmental task in itself. And at the same time, digital environments can also amplify pressures, such as those narrow body ideals I've mentioned, or sexual scripts that may impact self esteem and relational satisfaction. So, for us in our work, I think the challenge will be to meet clients where they are in a world where technology is not just a medium for sexuality, but a central player, right, in shaping desire, identity, and intimacy over our lifespan. So, as we start to bring this discussion to a close, I think it's important to remember that pornography's influence on sexual health is multifaceted, right? It's not simply a cause and effect equation, it's mediated by patterns of use, individual vulnerability factors, and the way technology delivers content. This is what I call the technological paradox, right? So the same tools that can challenge sexual health by promoting unrealistic expectations or compulsive use can also be leveraged to improve it. So technology does give us platforms for sexual health education, teletherapy, sexual rehabilitation tools, supportive communities, inclusive spaces. For individuals who might not have access to affirming resources in their offline lives. So, I think the path forward requires like informed dialogue, really nuanced research, and clinical innovation. And we have to resist both the moral panic and the technological determinism, that belief that technology inevitably shapes us in one direction. So I think our work is to help individuals cultivate healthy, informed relationships with both technology and sexuality across all stages of development. And that means for us, not only staying current with the research, but also being curious and open minded in our practice. We need to ask the right questions about technology use and create space for clients to reflect on its role in their sexual lives and be prepared perhaps to guide them without judgment towards healthier, more fulfilling expressions, at least, of intimacy in a digital world. So, in terms of specialized training, I think that this digital landscape, whether it's sexting, sex tech, digital pornography, our professional preparation has to keep pace. So we need to have a nuanced understanding of attraction, desire, and dysfunction that accounts for how technology mediates these experiences. So this includes both potential harms and benefits, right? Second, nuanced assessment. So we can't rely on simplistic intake questions like, do you watch pornography? As I've said, we need to explore consumption patterns, motivations, emotional responses, and the psychological and cultural context that surround use. So, for example, what role did pornography play in a client's early sexual identity formation? Are there patterns of compulsive use or is it primarily recreational? How does it intersect with their relationships, body image, and self-esteem? So third, we're looking at addressing tech specific issues. So interventions could be adapted for challenges like porn induced erectile dysfunction, technological dependency, distorted body image, and those blurred boundaries between virtual and real intimacy. Um, Finally, I think again promoting digital literacy. So I think that clients will benefit when they can critically evaluate sexual content online, understand the difference between performance and reality, and develop healthy embodied sexual experiences that prioritize mutual consent and authentic connection. So digital literacy to me is no longer optional. I think it's a key component of sexual health in the modern era. So of course, we all know my specialty or area is children, and I think that one of the most pressing challenges in school counseling today is that children are encountering explicit sexual content at increasingly younger ages. So, thanks to pervasive digital access, exposure is often unintentional, but still impactful, and shifting the landscape of sexual development and calling for earlier, more intentional intervention strategies. So, for younger audiences, early exposure can happen long before a child has the maturity to process what they're seeing. And this again can shape expectations around body, relationships, and pleasure in ways that may be unrealistic or even harmful. The developmental impact can be significant. Uh, Exposure during critical stages of growth can distort perceptions of consent, again, influence body image and affect emotional regulation. It could also interfere with forming healthy attachments, and these are basically setting patterns that may persist into adolescence and adulthood. I think the counselor's role in this area is expanding, so we can't rely solely on traditional sex ed frameworks that address puberty and reproduction in later grades, right? School counselors need to integrate digital literacy, media consumption awareness, and mental health implications into their work, especially as these issues overlap with identity development, self esteem, and peer relationships. And I think proactive education is essential, not reactive, but unfortunately, that's what happens a lot. So we need to, I think, rather cultivate digital resiliency from early grades, and we want to help students think critically about online content. We want to promote consent based sexual health education that's age appropriate and culturally responsive. And this includes, in my opinion, recognizing diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and ensuring that the resources we use are inclusive and affirming. So, addressing early exposure is not just about preventing harm, it's about equipping students with the tools to navigate an increasingly digital world in ways that can protect them. Thank you.